Hey, hello everybody. Welcome to the webcast on top three CISO strategic issues. I'm just pausing for a moment here to make sure everybody makes your way from the waiting room here into the main session. I see a number of people joining via the attendee list. So nice to virtually see you all here. And before we start and jump right into the material, for those of you I might not have met in real life or online at some point, just a very quick introduction. My name is Frank Kim. I've been teaching and writing classes with SANS for 17 years now, as I had various other day jobs along the way. I was the CISO at SANS for a little bit. I still lead our cloud security and cybersecurity leadership curricula, of which this content today is a part. Up until earlier this year, I was also the CISO in residence at a venture capital firm where we invested in various cybersecurity startups. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of an experiment here, a little bit of a test, I should say, before we jump into the material itself. I do have right here at my eye level the Q&A window, so at any point in time, if you have a question, feel free to drop it into the chat there, into the Q&A window. I also have the webinar chat open as well, and I'm going to just send a hello message to everybody right now. See if it comes through. This is a little bit of a test to see if you guys could respond. I'm seeing messages from you guys. Oh, Brian, hey, nice to virtually see you. All right, Charles, Igor, Nicholas, Wesley. All right, thank you guys all for chiming in here as well. I may, as we go along, ask various questions and ask you guys to chime in into the chat window. But if you do have a specific question, feel free to put it into the chat or put it into the QA window as well. So let's go ahead and jump right in here. And what we're going to be talking about today, well, is partly the result of the SANS CISO network survey that we did a little while ago. You may know that at SANS, we got a network of global CISOs, various CISOs from around the world of organizations in different industries, organizations of various sizes. And we asked them, we polled them on a number of different questions. And one of the first questions was, well, what are the main strategic issues that are on your radar as a security leader over the next 12 months? And if you just glance at these various items, you can see that they're all various evergreen items. These are things that we in security, security leaders, leaders broadly, are worried about, concerned about, thinking about on an ongoing basis. If you asked somebody 2 years ago, 5 years ago, the list would not be too dissimilar. Now, in the limited time that we have here today, we're not going to be able to talk through all of these various items, which is why we're going to focus on three, the top three specifically. But the other ones do deserve a quick mention as well. Building a sustainable, organizational, security-aware, and risk-aware culture, always top of mind, because I've seen many security teams over the years where the CISO leaves, key people leave, key talent leaves, and the security team, the various activities slowly start to degrade by varying degrees. That is an indication that there wasn't a, yes, sustainable security and risk-aware culture that was created. So very important. We all know that if somebody leaves your team, it can take weeks, months, many months even, or to potentially backfill that particular position. So recruitment, retention, and so on, keeping people happy, keeping people engaged, very important in terms of building a successful team. Geopolitics, global security. In the times in which we live, we've got various conflicts. We've got the war in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, tensions with China, tensions with Russia, and so on. So those drastically impact, well, it could have a big impact on what our business, what our organization is doing as well. Earlier this year, I did a little bit of a SANS roadshow in Europe, and one of our stops along the way was at NATO headquarters. And of course, this is a thing that is by nature of that organization is on many people's minds, everybody's minds. But for us today, yes, we are going to focus on the top three. That is government regulation, relations with the board, and going about obtaining some budget and corresponding funding. So let's go ahead and jump right in. From a regulation perspective, today we're going to be talking about just two specific things, two examples of regulations changes that have gone into effect just earlier this year and that are affecting pretty much every security team in the world. And the first one that we're going to jump in and talk about here are the updated SEC disclosure requirements. Now, I said these are examples, two examples of things that are affecting pretty much every security team in the world. But as you know, the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, is an entity that, well, oversees publicly traded companies specifically in the US. So that's not every company in the world, but some of these SEC requirements may impact providers, suppliers, and so on to public companies. But also, these are best practices that we are all looking at in terms of figuring out, understanding when do we determine when an incident should be disclosed in relation to other compliance and regulatory requirements as well. And specifically, the important point of this is, well, when is the incident material? Once it is material, as we will see on the next slide, hey, this has to be shared without quote unquote unreasonable delay. Before these new SEC disclosure requirements went into effect earlier this year, there was a lot of debate from the perspective of, well, if we reveal too much in these disclosures within 4 days, well, maybe we are giving other people, attackers and so on, unnecessary information. This is why a provision was added to these disclosure requirements to say, hey, if there could be a threat to national security, public safety, and so on, well, you can delay that reporting if you work appropriately with the Attorney General to say that, hey, these could have potential downstream consequences. The important thing for us here is that various regulatory requirements, standards, frameworks, and so on have now focused more on risk management, strategy, governance. The NIST cybersecurity framework, the updated version that now includes a sixth function called govern, right, to specifically highlight the importance of these govern high-level organizational activities, is an indication to me that the security industry, cybersecurity, has matured from where it started many years, some decades ago. And we know that from an SEC perspective, yes, we've got to report in the 8K when something happens and annually in the 10K. Now, what do we actually need to report? If there's a substantial likelihood that a reasonable shareholder would consider it important, or it could have been viewed by a reasonable investor as having significantly altered the total mix of information available. So there is some wiggle room here in terms of reporting. Organizations, we're carefully looking at the various 8Ks and 10Ks that get published and to see, well, how much are organizations going to be disclosing in how proactive they're actually going to be. And related to this is, of course, the SolarWinds case. Now, I'm sure you all are familiar to some degree about the SolarWinds attack. We're not going to go into all of the technical details, but what was interesting about this is in the aftermath of the attack, arguably the largest, well, most important, most cited software supply chain attack in history, affecting many US government entities, departments, agencies, and various enterprises around the world. In the aftermath of this, because SolarWinds is a publicly traded company, the SEC charged SolarWinds, but not just SolarWinds, the company, that has happened many times before to other organizations, but for the first time, they brought specific charges against their CISO, Tim Brown, stating that both the company, the organization, and the CISO defrauded investors by overstating how well they were doing from a security perspective. In their investigation, they looked at a bunch of information, gathered a bunch of evidence, and they found that, hey, even internally, a company engineer had said, hey, the remote access setup is not very secure. And we now know that the way that the attacker was able to initially get into SolarWinds was because of a, well, yes, insecure remote access setup, configuration, deployment, and so on. And well, this is a big deal. And when this happened, CISOs, security leaders around the world, paused and they said, uh-oh, do I really want that CISO job? I've met numerous people in the last few years where they say, hey, I'm happy to be a manager, a director, a senior VP, maybe even a deputy CISO. But I've had people say, well, hey, I don't want to be a CISO because of the potential liability that occurs with this particular situation. Now, fast forward a little bit. What happened? Earlier this year, I lose track of time, everybody, just a few months ago, the SEC, a US District Court judge, ruled on the SEC charges. And they, well, you know what? If anybody has checked out these charges, please do chime in with a thumbs up or a +1 here in the chat. I'm curious, how many people have been keeping up with this? I've been anxiously awaiting this ruling. Well, the judge specifically dismissed the vast majority of the claims against both SolarWinds and Tim Brown, the SolarWinds CISO. Looks like Jason has been following this case. Jason, thank you for chiming in here. Now, they did importantly, though. Now, there was a number of charges that were dismissed because the SEC, as is kind of their charter, as is their goal, as is their job, they are looking for, well, yeah, securities fraud based on misstatements and deficiencies and so on. They specifically, arguably now because of this ruling, we could say they reached a little bit. They were, for the first time, trying to tie cybersecurity deficiencies to the other requirements for internal accounting and disclosure controls. But the judge specifically said, you know what? These are separate. The internal accounting, disclosure controls, those are separate from various cybersecurity controls. So they basically said something along the lines of, hey, nice try, but not this time. It's not going to work. But they importantly, as Rajiv, yes, exactly, most of the charges were dismissed, but they did uphold one charge in particular. Specifically, here in the middle of the slide, they said, hey, there was securities fraud based upon a publicly accessible security statement PDF. This is a PDF that, well, like many organizations have, it's an overview of what are the various security practices that the organization has been doing. And it basically says this is what we do from an authentication and access control, infrastructure security, a software development security perspective, and so on. And after reviewing that, they said, well, these statements in the security document, the PDF itself, publicly disclosed on the website, these were misleading because it described to SolarWinds customers and potential customers practices that later evidence were shown to not necessarily be being followed. And specifically, here's a key word here, right? Something that is maybe is not something that comes up in normal conversation, is that the SolarWinds CISO acted with scienter, right? What is scienter? It's specifically, quote unquote, the intent to deceive, manipulate, defraud, or at least knowing that that conduct could potentially be incorrect, right? And so as a result, this particular charge was upheld. The main takeaway here is, hey, that sure, hey, there is some additional liability just for a CISO, just like there is for any other C-level executive in the organization, but most organizations have D&O, directors and officers coverage, insurance coverage for the officers. But if you are a CISO or thinking about taking a security leadership position, part of your negotiation process should state that, hey, am I covered with D&O like the other executives? And don't just take their word for the fact that, oh, hey, you're covered because you're a quote unquote officer. Most of the time, in most organizations, the CISO, just because you have that title, doesn't mean you are actually a named officer of the organization. So yes, it's very important to make sure that you do have that directors and officers coverage. And as we see from the outcome of the ruling, make sure that any public statements, like in the PDF, or of course in official statements like the 8K and the 10K, which the judge ruled, hey, those were not misleading, make sure that those are all factually correct. Here is an example. Down at the bottom is a snippet from the security statement. And if you just glance at this, it's typical things like we would normally talk about in our security programs. We require authorized users to have unique IDs, and we've got password best practices, and so on. Well, they specifically said, because remember, how did the attackers get into SolarWinds? Misconfigured, weak, insecure deployment of remote access, and there was insecure passwords being used throughout in various parts of the organization for certain systems, like the password SolarWinds 123. Passwords specifically didn't have corresponding standards and policies associated with them based upon what they found after the investigation. So this is where there was that mismatch here. All right. Now, I'm just curious, quick show of hands, quick plus or thumbs up here in the chat. Do you work at a publicly traded company? All right, Seth raised your hand. All right, Pablo. All right, thank you very much. All right, looks like Ritwik as well. Now, I'm also curious, who here has concern about taking a CISO job or a senior security job because of the potential liability? All right, if so, looks like Brian does. A couple other people, Seth has raised hands as well, a number of folks. Jürgens, Charles, thank you very much. All right, so yes, it is definitely a concern, but like any risk, like crossing the street, like driving your car every day, there are other ways to mitigate that risk, like with insurance, getting agreements in place, and so on. And of course, being transparent and truthful in all of the things that you do in terms of your public statements. All right, so let's go ahead and segue now. I mentioned in this portion, we were going to talk about two different regulatory changes, and there is a lot going on in the world from a regulatory perspective, which is why it was the number one item in our CISO survey results. And one thing that has been around for a while is the NIS, the European Union Network and Information Security Directive. Now, a little bit of background before I go into this here. I think we all know about GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that went into effect a number of years ago. Well, there's a difference between two things in the EU. There's a difference between a regulation, which applies to all EU countries. They have to do the things that are described in the regulation, versus a directive. A directive specifically is the EU comes up with this and says to all of the member countries, all of the member states, they say, hey, we would like you to incorporate the items in these directives into your national laws. Right? So it's a little bit more distributed here. And as a result, various EU member countries were required to develop a strategy on security, have a CERT, right, have various security best practices, and so on. But because it's a directive, it is a little bit up to interpretation and enforcement of the various countries. And since NIS first went, NIS, the original NIS, first became effective, I forget now, about 10 years ago, it's been a little bit inconsistent. As a result, fast forward to today, now, this is what led to the EU coming up with what is called NIS2. Right? The NIS2 directive just went into effect last month, October 2024. All right, where now we've got stronger requirements for various organizations in the EU. If you are in the EU, or if you are required to comply with various NIS2 directives, please go ahead and raise your hand, chime in with a +1. By the way, Alex, thank you for the endorsement for the various courses. Appreciate it very much. Now, with NIS2, I see some people raising their hands here. All right, thank you very much, Charles. Now, what is different about NIS2? Well, it is the scope has expanded. I see Igor, Rajiv as well. Now, there is a difference between essential versus important sectors. I haven't listed them all here on the slide, but now there is a difference between what is essential, energy, banking, transportation, and so on, versus other quote unquote important sectors. They also define a size threshold, large versus small entities. Now, depending upon your size and your sector, well, you might have to meet and comply with certain requirements. But each member, a directive, is incorporated into the country's national laws. So it's up to the country itself to determine, well, how are we going to implement these various requirements? Are we going to be more strict than what NIS2 specifically describes? Or are we going to just try to do specifically what it says? This has led to, well, to be honest, a lot of work for various companies that operate in the EU. Why? Because, well, what if you are a global company? What if you operate in multiple countries within the EU? Which country do you report, right? Like early notification warning, which country do you report to? Is it where you're headquartered? Is it where there's other operations? All of this needs to be defined, and it is still a little bit uncertain. Those are the types of details that need to be worked out. Also, to whom do you report? Well, we know with GDPR, you report to the various data protection authorities that are defined in different parts of the EU whenever there is a privacy issue, a privacy complaint, and so on. But with the NIS2 directive, well, you need to report to the cybersecurity agency within your country, the country that you are deciding to or needing to report to. For example, in Belgium, there is the CCB, Cybersecurity Center Belgium, and when you are reporting, well, when something happens, you report to them, and they help you in various ways along the way. Now, for the first time, this is why it's also more serious, is NIS2 has various fines, like we see down here at the bottom. All right, so very important. A lot of organizations are trying to figure out how they're going to meet these various requirements. Yes, again, why compliance, regulatory concerns were number one in our list. One small detail to mention here, you'll notice it says incident notification within 72 hours. Now, the EU is, well, from what I can tell, standardizing on incident notification within 3 days. But remember, what did we just see with the SEC updated disclosure requirements? Well, the SEC said, hey, when it's known to be material, then you have to disclose within 4 days. So there is a little bit of a difference between different parts, different regions of the world, but it's within the same general window, 3 to 4 days here. So those were the two examples that we were going to talk about from a regulatory perspective, the SEC updated requirements and the NIS2 directive here. Now let's go on to another evergreen topic, which is board communications. Now let's do another quick poll here. Chime in here in chat or raise your hand. Who here has ever had to either present to the board or come up with, create the slides that were going to be presented to the board? Robert, I see. Raul, Pablo, Ryan, Carolyn, Brian. All right, Andy. All right, so many hands, so many names going up here, right? A number of different messages just came in here. A lot of people here in chat as well. Thank you guys all for chiming in. Well, as a result, remember, this was the number 2 strategic concern of CISOs in our network. So we want to go over some tips on how to better, more effectively communicate with the board. And we're going to go ahead and start with some basics here, just to make sure we're all on the same page. While quite a number of you have already presented to the board or created the slides, a number of you, quite a lot of you, did not raise your hand. So as a result, we want to remind ourselves, well, hey, what is the board of directors? Who are they? How are they structured? How are they comprised? Remember, the most important person in any presentation is the audience. So we need to understand, remind ourselves that the board of directors, what do? Well, they're not responsible for the day-to-day activities. They oversee, they govern the organization's activities in a number of different ways, in a number of different areas, which is why board of directors is commonly divided up into different committees. The executive committee, which you may or may not have a formal executive committee on your organization's board. That's usually the chair of the board, the CEO, maybe some other board members as well, focused on strategy, corresponding execution. You got the compensation committee. Are we paying Elon Musk too much? Is the SEC, are other people, is the world, is the society going to complain that Elon Musk gets billions of dollars of stock grants? That's the type of thing that the compensation committee would normally be thinking about. Nominating and governance, do we have the right experience, skills, diversity on the board of directors itself? Now, this gets us to the 2 committees that we in security typically interact with the most. That is the audit committee, one of the most powerful entities in the organization that historically reports on and oversees financial related concerns, but because of the corresponding related regulatory and compliance concerns, security has historically commonly reported up through the audit committee. Some organizations specifically say, we want the audit committee to be focused on the important financial related matters. As a result, they might have a separate risk committee, or we in security might report up through a separate technology committee, wherever it might actually be, for different non-financial related regulatory compliance security related concerns. All right, so if that's a little bit of background about the board of directors, well, what about the board overall itself? Now check this out. Long time ago, some time ago, I was on the board of a nonprofit organization. And it turns out that, well, hey, our job, even in a nonprofit, just like a public company or any other organization, one of our main responsibilities was to evaluate and review the performance of in that particular case, the executive director of the nonprofit. Or for public company boards, it is, yes, to put simply, hire, fire, support, evaluate the CEO. Make sure that there is a good plan, a solid strategy in place, and that there is effective governance. There is this duty to monitor concept that was, I forgot to verbalize it, but was mentioned on one of the prior slides related to the SEC, that senior leadership, the board of directors, have a duty to monitor, to run the organization responsibly, that there is effective governance in place to manage various risks that the enterprise faces, including corresponding cybersecurity related risks. Now, there is one important difference between a large company and a smaller company. By proxy, we say a public company or even a private company here as well, because at a private company board, well, some of the board members may be a little bit more operationally involved. But for most companies, right, large companies, public companies, the board of directors are not going to get operationally involved at all. And unless you work at a technology company where there might be some board members with a technology background, the vast majority of board members do not know about technology. Does not mean that they're dumb. They just don't know about all of the IT, the technology, and the security acronyms because they are former CEOs, current CEOs, CFOs, COOs, other leaders in the organization that have built and run successful businesses. And as a result, what do they care about the most? Profit and loss, right? Are we making the bottom line or not, right? For-profit companies. And are we achieving our organization's mission for even for-profit companies, but especially for mission-driven organizations? So what are some key questions that the board of directors is going to ask? Basically, they are going to say, where's my risk? What are you doing? And you know what? Is there anything else? The board of directors and senior leadership, they want your help to understand the corresponding cyber risk related to any activities, strategic projects that the organization might be undertaking. Basically, they want you to help them look around the proverbial corner here to see what else, what would happen if we tried to roll out this new business or strategic initiative. And oh, by the way, what are the options? What are the corresponding mitigation plans is basically what they are asking, what they are wondering. And they're also asking, well, you know what? How do we compare to others? I had a meeting. I tell this all the time because this was early in my leadership career. And I set up a meeting with my CFO. And I had this secret in my mind agenda to not get more money from her at that moment, but try to build up a relationship so that it would be more likely that she would approve our business case in the future. Well, about 5-10 minutes into the meeting, she stops. She says, Frank, we get it. We in finance, we know cybersecurity is important, but we want to know, are we spending too much? Are we spending too little? How are we spending in comparison to our industry peers? Right? Are we doing the right thing? Are we running faster than the bear in the forest or our friend in the forest who the bear is also chasing? These are the types of things that the board of directors wants to have a discussion around. Now, when you get to the point, many of you said you have created or contributed to board presentations. So a little bit of background here, right? The board presentations. Let me ask you guys. I'm going to ask you to chime into the chat here. When you have your obligatory 15-minute board presentation, how many slides should you bring in? Should you intend to present to the board? Go ahead and chime in here in the chat window. How many slides should you plan to present? Brian says 2 to 4, Seth 6 to 10, Caroline says 6, M says 4, Dutch 4, Rajiv 3 to 5, 3 to 5. All right, so we've got a high confidence interval of, I think, 1 to 5, 2 to 5 slides here from the vast majority of people. A little bit on the higher side, 6 to 7. So it depends, right? But yes, you're going to have just a handful of slides, basically. A handful or less of slides because they need to be short. They need to be concise. But you've got a lot of information that ideally you would want to share. I was doing a board presentation. I was doing a consulting engagement. This company asked me to come in and present to their board about the threat landscape and how that threat landscape was related to their industry and their organization in particular. And I didn't have very many slides. I forget. I think I had 3 slides. But they also asked me to create a bunch of pre-read material. Now, this pre-read material was just a narrative, a Word document, basically. Just it was 2 or 3 pages at that particular time. And because that board was very on top of things, right? Board members have that duty to monitor. They have that responsibility, effective governance. And so, yes, you expect them to be very responsible in reading the information and the background. So a lot of times you might have some pre-read material or you'd send over the information ahead of time. You might also have, now you might have 3 to 5 main slides, but you're also usually going to have some number of appendix slides. You don't intend to present those appendix slides, but if somebody asks a question, if something comes up, you could say, well, yes, for reference, that is in the appendix. That's something that you can go back and refer to, or maybe you can quickly flip to that slide to build some confidence that you have done all of that homework in terms of that particular question. But you might also use the appendix slides as pre-read material as well. The main thing here in even a 15-minute board presentation is the goal is not to inundate them with information. The goal is to ideally treat it as a discussion. steering the discussion to how security relates to the strategic objectives, the business objectives of the organization. All right. Now, there's a question here. What do top CISOs include in updates to the board? I think everybody is familiar with the annual RSA conference, RSAC. Well, you may or may not be familiar with a separate group within RSA called ESAF, the Executive Security Action Forum. Now, this is a private, confidential, invite-only group of Fortune 1000 CISOs. And a little while ago, RSAC, in combination with some of these CISOs, published a document, a research document. Here you see the cover page in the lower left-hand corner, what top CISOs include in updates for the board. This is freely available. If you just Google for this on RSA, you will find it. And they specifically say, well, in every board presentation, CISOs anonymously shared elements of their actual board presentations. The folks at RSA went back and analyzed it and said, hey, these are the 5 things that in some form or fashion, every CISO includes in updates to the board. Specifically, hey, what's changed in the threat landscape? What's changed? What are threat actors doing? What activity is going on out there? What's changing in the industry overall? And how could that be related to us, like the various regulatory requirements? The corresponding risks that therefore that our organization faces. So basically, the top 2 bullets are saying, hey, what's going on in the world around us? All right. Then you tie that back, bring that back to your organization even further. What are some significant security incidents that we have had or others in the industry, our industry, have also had? Because when there is a headline-making incident, headline-making breach, you can bet that your leadership and the board is also going to ask you, well, what does this mean for us? Do we have particular issues related as well? So basically it's, well, what are the risks in our organization? What's going on in the world? And number 2, what risks do we face? And then number 3 is, what are we doing about it? And what we're doing about it is, well, reflected in your maturity score. How well are we doing? Remember what my CFO asked? She said, how are we doing in comparison to our industry peers? That is directly related to the maturity score itself. And then you need to say, well, hey, here's what we're doing. And here's what we're going to do in the future about it in relation to the various security initiatives. Right? So 5 high-level types of things that you're going to include in every board update. Kirby, thanks a lot for sharing the link. Now, at SANS, our late founder Alan Paller and John Pescator, they went around some time ago and did a What Works series in CISO leadership. And they talked to various CISOs, security leaders, and board members. And one board member in particular said a big part of being believable, building our trust, is showing how we compare to competitors, other industries, some kind of standards or benchmarks. Exactly what we've been talking about here. All right. So to kind of wrap this up from a board presentation perspective, let me start with an example. I heard a story of a CISO that went into his first 15-minute board presentation, and you guys all said this earlier. We all agree that we should have roughly 3 to 5 slides in your board presentation, but maybe more in the appendix and so on. He went into his first board presentation with 30 slides, and these were not appendix slides. These were primary slides. After the board meeting, he went back to his office. His team was waiting for him because they knew it was the first board presentation. They asked him, how did it go? And the CISO said, I think it went great. I got through all 30 of my slides. You can imagine that it didn't go very well. As soon as those boardroom doors closed, what did the board say? The board said, I never want to see that guy again. That was the sentiment, right? So, well, when you are presenting to the board, sure, there are some bit of information that you want to convey, but you cannot only focus on the logic. You can't only focus on what you want them to know. All of the details that we have to deal with every single day. What you want them to know is that, hey, you understand the business and you have a plan. That's it. Remember, tying back to what do top CISOs present to the board, your maturity score and your security initiatives, right? Tie back to, well, why those are important to meet various business goals, right? That's at a high level what you want them to know, not 30 slides of all of the details. So what's important is, what do you leave out, right? What do you leave out? Because you want to leave out more stuff. You're not hiding stuff. You just want to don't go into all of the details, because the main thing is you want the board to feel something. You want the board to feel confident. And when those boardroom doors close, you want them to say that, you know what? Hey, the board, what you actually know what you're doing, and the organization is in good hands. Remember, focus on the feel and the say, right? You want them to feel confident. That would be the main thing with your board presentation in terms of the goals. And lastly here, right, another board member as part of this research said security people don't speak our language. In fact, at each briefing, they seem to speak a different language. So goes back to, what do you want them to feel? What do you want them to say? Not just what you want them to know. All right, now this gets us back to our agenda here, the very last topic for the day, which is about budget and funding. Budget and funding here, right? The number 3 item in our CISO survey results. So before we get into the details, you know what? Let me go back one slide. Let me pause to set the stage here. Now, part of this budget and funding, is coming up with a business case. A business case that, now you're in the vast majority of organizations, you do not go to the board to ask for money. You don't go to the board to ask for budget. Because remember, the board's role is governance. And who are you going to ask money for? Well, usually it is some combination, depending on how your organization works. The CFO, the finance team, the competing for dollars with other parts of the organization, the CEO, and so on. It is not going to be the board. Now, the board does want to know, hey, directionally, how much are we spending in comparison to our industry peers? Should we think about more broader investments to increase our maturity to a certain extent? But they're not going to get into the details of all of the nitty-gritty of the business case and your justification and all of your projects in the vast majority of organizations, in large organizations, public organizations, and so on. But if you might work at a smaller organization, a privately held organization, yeah, things might work a little bit differently. But for the most part, the board does not do this. So when you are coming up with your business case, how can you go about doing this? Well, I like to start with an analogy. Now, some of you, many of you, maybe have seen and read a home appraisal report. When you go ahead and buy a home, or you need to get a loan, or you need to refinance, well, somebody needs to come appraise the home to determine that should the lender give you a certain amount of loan, because is the home actually really worth that much? If you're like me and you read all of the details and have read all of the details, every single word in the home appraisal report, you'll know that the appraiser always includes 3 different approaches to coming up with the value of your home. Number 1, right, is, well, if your home burns down to the ground, what is the cost to rebuild? And based on that cost to rebuild, well, that they extrapolate the actual current market value of your home. Number 2, and type this into chat, what is the most common approach that real estate appraisers use to come up with the value of your property? I'm going to pause here for a moment. This is not a trick question. Hopefully some of you guys know this. The most common way, right? David, thank you for chiming in. David, since you were the quickest on the trigger, Andy also mentions recent sale. If we are ever able to meet in person, please remind me. I would be happy to buy the first round of drinks. So David, yes, happy to do that since you were quickest on the trigger, but Rajiv, Andy, Alan, right, Nick, very close behind. The most common approach is the sales comparison, sales comparable approach. What are similar homes selling for on a price per square foot basis? And then number 3 would be the income approach. If, right, you are renting out your home, if you have an apartment building, well, based upon what the rents are, what does that mean for the extrapolated value of your property itself? The real estate appraiser always uses all 3 approaches, but depending on the situation, they weight each of the approaches a little bit differently. Single family residence, you're going to favor the sales comparison approach. For an apartment building, you're going to favor the income approach. For a commercial piece of property, like a wharf or a pier, you're going to favor the cost approach. If it burns down, what's the cost to rebuild? All right. So I mentioned all of this here. Hopefully this is, well, maybe this is obvious, maybe it's not, because you, as the security leader, like the real estate appraiser, in building your business case, you are always going to use all 3 approaches. You're going to use the cost approach, what's it take the cost to recover from a breach, the sales comparison approach, What are comparable security teams in the similar industry doing and paying from a security perspective? And, well, what business innovation, what I call the business innovation approach, what can you gain? What can your organization gain from doing these types of security activities? So we're going to talk about these here one at a time. Number one, the cost approach, typically calculated on a cost per record lost. The most recent Ponemon cost of data breach study, which is the authoritative source for cost per record loss around the world, says that the global average is 169 US dollars. This includes direct and indirect costs responding to the breach, but indirect costs like loss of customers who don't shop at your store anymore because they don't trust you, and so on. So $169. Let's pretend you've got 10 million records in your company, and you multiply $169 times 10 million records, and you go to leadership and say, hey, I need 1.69 million dollars. No, $1.69 billion. I can't do math at this time. Well, are you going to get the money? Definitely not, right? Because it's too high. Ponemon specifically says, hey, you know what? This cost per record, it overestimates the cost of large breaches and it underestimates the cost of small breaches. Well, what can we do about this? Verizon, in a prior data breach investigation report, said, you know what? Why don't we go ahead and analyze real cyber insurance claim data? They went ahead and gathered a bunch of data and they said, well, the estimated loss of record lost is only 58 cents per record. Now, I think we all have a sense that that's too low, right? Why? Well, because insurance doesn't always pay out everything. It doesn't include perhaps the indirect costs, many other factors here, why that insurance information might be low on a cost per record basis. Well, this is where in the newer Ponemon data breach investigation reports, they specifically said, you know what? Our prior data, the $169 per record, that is evaluated only on breaches of 100,000 records or less. Very small. So they say, you know what? We also need to analyze what they call mega breaches. Mega breaches, as you see from this chart, anywhere from 1 million records all the way up to, in their data set, 60 million records. And if we do a little bit of math here, right, the cost per record lost is now a range between $6.25 and 42 US dollars. So this is much more reasonable if you have 10 million records in your organization. So we've talked about all of this here because you can use this range of data to say, well, this could be the range, an example range of what we might lose if we had a serious security breach. All right, now moving on to the second way that we would justify our business case is how are we doing in comparison to our industry peers? Typically, this is done in two ways. Number one, a spending comparison that's historically done as a percent of IT budget spent on security. The average historical rubric is 5% across all industries. 5% of the IT budget is spent on security. You might go back to work and you might calculate all of this and you might say, hey, we're kind of getting screwed. We're only spending 2% of the IT budget on security. And you go to senior leadership and say, I need 3% more. Are you going to get it? Well, no, but this is one factor, one element that helps frame their thinking overall. Now, that's the industry historical average. This can range anywhere from 1 to 13+%. Now, everybody, do you know the highest percent of IT budget spent on security is attributed to which industry? Does anybody know? Chime in here into the chat window. And because, well, yes, it does depend on the industry itself. All right, David got it here, right? It is the financial sector. Now, David, I already owe you a first round of drinks, so I don't know if I could do a second one unless we meet at 2 different events here. Yes, so it depends on the industry, as Alan and Dutch say as well. Hey, Dutch, nice to virtually see you here as well. Nice, a lot of familiar names here. All right, Ritwick chimes in as well. All right, so you do not want to rely only on this spending comparison. Well, what else do you do? This is where the maturity comparison comes into play. All right, what are other firms doing, paying, and doing? Now, how do you know? How do you know what other firms are doing? Well, it just might be that you're an experienced security leader, you've got other CISO friends, you're part of some industry groups like various ISACs, like we see here, Well, you might go ahead and have a sense of what they're doing, what they're spending on from a security perspective. So you might be able to get some comparable information that way. But I'll tell you up front, if you are at a large company and you want some industry comparison data, well, you've got to pay for it. You've got to buy it. You got to buy it from one of the big research companies like a Gartner or one of the big consulting organizations like in the Big Four, other security firms, because they do a ton of research, a ton of engagements every year. They aggregate all of that data together and then they give you the updated information. So it can cost anywhere. Now chime in here, everybody. If you have paid for this information before, I'm curious what you have paid for it. For smaller type of engagements, in some years past, I paid as little as $50,000. Now I say little, some of you might say that that is a lot, upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars, right, to get this industry comparable data in a customized way. And you've got to pay that pretty much every single year. When 80% of my career has been at large enterprises. So most of the time I have just paid for this data and this analysis. In smaller companies, I've got a limited security budget. So I tell senior leadership, I say, hey, there's a couple ways to get this information. And I lay out the different options. We can go ahead and pay it, consulting company, and so on. We can do it internally. Here are the pros and cons. And because I've got a small security budget at a smaller organization, I say, hey, we're going to do this in-house. We're going to do this internally. And this is what it means. It's a little bit imprecise. We don't have the latest data, but based on what we know, this is how we're going to do the comparison. And they agree. We get their buy-in up front. If the company grows, the organization grows, well, you're going to need to start spending, buying this particular information because at a very large company, senior leadership, when they ask you, how did you come up with this industry comparison data? And you say, well, based upon my industry experience and my contacts and what information I gather from other security leaders in the industry. And oh, by the way, we hired Sally, the smartest person from the Big Four consultancy that we use, and she came on board and helped us do this. That answer is not good enough, right? Because they want the neutral third-party stamp of approval in a large company. They want to know that some independent source was the provider of this industry comparison information. So bottom line, large company, you've got to buy it. Nobody chimed in with any dollar amounts here. Right, either you haven't paid for it or you don't want to share, which is totally fine. But if anybody could share, feel free to chime in into the chat window. And the reason we want to do this maturity comparison is because we are paying for basically the yellow line on this example chart. Now, remember, what do top CISOs present to the board? Maturity and initiatives, and how are we doing in comparison to others? Well, here on this slide, if you don't have a slide like this, I've been talking about this forever, I've used a slide like this forever, saved my bacon many times over the years. At a glance, you can see where you are today, the dark shade of blue, where you want to get to in the future, the light shade of blue, and how you compare to others in your industry, the yellow line. In real life, that yellow line is going to be a little bit different for each of the 6 different functions on the y-axis from the NIST cybersecurity framework here. But this illustrative example shows, hey, the type of visualization that you want to have. All right, Dutch, thank you for chiming in with those example costs as well. All right, now the last thing to do, the business innovation approach, the equivalent of the income approach. What can you gain? What can you gain from this? And Alex, I see some of your comments here. Thank you very much for the endorsement of the various courses. Appreciate it. Yes, I do think it could be very helpful. Thank you very much. Now, the business innovation approach. This is where, well, we need to do these things because we need to comply with the latest SEC disclosure requirements. We need to meet the various NIS2 requirements. We need to continue to support GDPR. But what else? Well, not just compliance, not just regulatory. An easy way for you as a security leader to start doing this is to go back and look at all of your security team activities, either for the security program as a whole or for your specific area of responsibility, and roughly determine what percentage of those activities are run the business activities, keep the lights on, keep the wheels on the bus activities, versus what percent are innovative, transform the business type of activities, like cloud migration, like digital transformation, like the adoption and corresponding security of GenAI. Go find the biggest IT projects, because those are usually the ones that people have, by their internal investments, said that these are going to help move the needle for the business, and go figure out how to support those large initiatives. and the new technology changes that are going on. Redwick also points out the BIA, the business impact analysis here, is in terms of analyzing the impact on AI security as well. Exactly. All right. So very good. Now we talk about this here because you as the manager, you as the leader, right? You want to use all three approaches in coming up with your business case, right? But you want to weight each of them differently. The cost approach, right? If you got a breach, you got the sales comparison approach and the innovation approach, the income approach that we just talked about. But the main thing here is, might sound a little counterintuitive, don't just ask for the money. You've got to show how, right, you are going to solve various business problems. Sell the vision for the security team and then let the case speak for itself. In years past, I made a mistake. I did all this work to come up with the business case. And I said, this is it. This is what we need the money for. So I went to leadership with one option. I said, hey, well, we need this investment to do these things. And leadership said, well, that makes sense. But what if we do a little bit less of this? What if we do a little bit more of this? What if we tweak this? You know, what if we don't have this much money available to allocate to security? What should we do? As a result, what I learned the hard way is don't just go in with one option in your business case. Make sure you have three options with various pros and cons. And the three options are going to look like this. You're going to have a low, medium, and high, right? That differing amounts of business value, risk reduction, and corresponding cost. And your recommendation is always going to be the middle one, option B. You always have to have a recommendation as well. But if they choose option A, yeah, that's not so bad because for me, I always put option A and B relatively close together. So I'm still happy. If they choose option C, oh, well, I'm happy with that because it's the most investment, but I'm also scared at the same time because I'm worried, shoot, how are we going to accomplish all of these things that we put in option C? All right, now David has a good comment here in terms of the run the business doesn't get as much attention funding as the innovation because it's not seen as exciting and as value add, right? That is the challenge, right? With having a, run the business kind of compliance driven, right? And this is where you can elevate the game when you've got those new compliance initiatives, requirements, and so on. You will transfer some amount of those to the run the business type of activities after year number one. All right, so this brings us almost to the end here. So we talked about three different things, everybody. We talked about regulatory changes. We talked about communicating with the board. And we just finished off on some tips for framing your business case overall. Now, a lot of times related to these topics, people say, Frank, what is the one class? What is the one thing that I should do to become a CISO? And at SANS, we don't necessarily think it's one thing. So we've got something new to share with you. We're sharing publicly for the first time here. You might be familiar with what we call our cybersecurity leadership triads that we believe to be a modern security leader, whether you want to be an operational security executive to build a vulnerability management program, implement controls, build your SOC, very important. To be a transformational security leader is a combination of understanding the technology, like we kind of mentioned, things like cloud, GenAI, identity, all of those things, right? But a combination of that with strategy, putting together your plan, understanding the changing landscape around you, building a sustainable, security-aware, and risk-aware culture. Those are things that help you become a quote-unquote transformational security leader. But we have a brand new cyber risk officer triad. That is a combination of, yes, still understanding the foundations of technology, but understanding how to manage risk, but also manage incidents as well in times of crisis. So we've got this website down here, this link down here at the bottom, as a token of acknowledgement. If anybody happens to finish the three classes associated with any of these triads, and again, the cyber risk officer is not yet even live on that website. You guys are getting a little sneak peek, a little preview here, is you get your name added to the website for each of these corresponding triads that you might have completed, and you get a special challenge coin in recognition. And here, I'll also mention we've got this cybersecurity wireframe that says, hey, what is the main focus of each of our various SANS classes that you see over here on the left-hand side, and the corresponding mapping for each of the three triads, either from a transformational, from a build, from a safeguarding your organization perspective. With that, right, we've got our overall cybersecurity leadership curriculum. We've got the link, the landing page here at the bottom of the slide. We got various courses here in terms of the various activities that we just talked about. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close it out. I'll pause to see if there's any other questions or any other comments. If we're not connected already on LinkedIn, please do shoot me a connection request. Would love to stay in touch. If there's anything that you want to chat about, brainstorm about your security program, your security leadership journey, I'm happy to have those conversations as well. So if there aren't any other questions, all right, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Frank, for your presentation and for helping to bring content like this to the SANS community. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. You can find your CPEs for all completed webcasts by logging into your SANS portal account, navigating to your account dashboard, then clicking My Webcasts. You can then download your CPE on the right-hand side of the webpage. Until next time, take care, and we hope to see you again soon.